Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second episode of season 4 of the Build Show. Uh, Me and Ralph tonight going to talk about the bridges that we've built. And first, I'll show you the Google image of the bridge that I'm working on because it's a prototype bridge. It exists in the real world, and I've been working on it. I'm going to show you some of that progress tonight. But welcome back to our episode. I know we're a little bit late on this episode. I was a little sick previous week, and we pushed this show off by a couple weeks. But hi, Ralph.
Howdy, howdy. And how's
Oh,
everybody tonight? Who we got? Lynn McCurdy.
and if you guys do have any comments, ask us questions, and we'll get to them between the videos. We have pre-recorded videos, and we're just going to talk over each of those. So. Um, I'm going to go ahead. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and play the sped up version of the progress that I've made, and then we'll take a brief moment and talk a minute or answer any questions you have, and then we'll play the version of the bridge that Ralph's built so far, which is spectacularly impressive. I really enjoyed following his work there as well. So, all right, here's the first one. So I built this paper template. I actually have several versions of this paper template. This particular version of the template is the inverse. So it's the upside down view of the bridge that lets me work on it. I mean, it's the same curve radius either way, but it
It's a
let me work on it
mirror
partially
image.
upside down.
It's a mirror image.
Yeah, it's like a mirror image or yeah, mirror image. It has a slight curve. It's the same rate. It's a consistent radius. I have some bridges on the lower level that terminate immediately off the bridge, so they actually have an easement on the bridge and then a fixed radius prior to leaving the bridge. I have one that is the one that I built the styrofoam piers for it, or piers rather for. It is I think it's a 16-foot radius or maybe a 14-foot radius, but it has an easement as it approaches because there's a turnout immediately adjacent to the bridge, like an inch off the bridge abutment. But this one is a 22-foot radius, 22-foot radius bridge. So anyway, I laid it all out, and that took me a lot of time to figure out the layout for that because I had to figure it out for where the panels break and what's prototypical. So I have a breakdown of the bridge that has the sections between the section above the tower is 4 3/8. The section between the towers is 8 13/16, and it has to be pretty precise. And then I had this gap because it has that slight curve. I have to cut a gap on one side and across most of the top of it. Um, and here I'm using a carbon or a metal cutting hacksaw blade. The wood cutting hacksaw blades, or plastic rather, PVC cutting hacksaw blades, cut a little bit wider gap than these. These cut basically a 16th, and when I put the bend in this thing to make the curve, it basically closes that gap up. But I cut about a third of the way through, maybe half the way through with that, and then I cut the last little bit with this jeweler's saw, which cuts about less than a 32nd of a width. This is the saw I use on a lot of track work, and it makes that bend so that it can make the bend, and it basically closes the gap up. And I'll show you how I solve for that in a minute. I'm not going to show you all of these cuts. I destroyed the first piece of U channel trying to cut it with a power saw. I marked it all out and then tried to cut it with a bandsaw, and I nicked or cut in very slightly, nicked the far side that has to stay intact, and that very slight. My color car's rolling back and forth there. Um, I very slightly nicked the opposing side that has to stay intact, and it softened the rigidity of the thing up considerably. So here, I'm not even cutting all the way to the other side. I'm cutting, a 16th or an eighth, away from the other side, and then because it's just aluminum, it will still bend and close that gap up. So, and I'm not going to show you all of these. I cut this off in a second after some number of gaps cut. But I have to cut every 4 3/8, and then every 8 13, and then 4 3/8, 8 13. I laid it out and just squared it. And then there's some approaches. One of the approaches on one side is like 5 7/8. That's like a 30-second light, a 5 7/8, a 5 7/8 light. But you've got to get that right because you want that break point where it bends slightly. You want your panels to work out correctly there. Also, I wanted it so that I could, on at least some of them, where I could lose the web or the what do you call those? The rib. So I could lose the rib on some of those. So now the prototype, they are separate bridge pieces bolted together. So in a lot of cases where the 4 3/8 piece that's over the tower meets the 8 13 piece that's between the towers, you need both ribs where those meet. But you've got to cut these up. I also wanted an even number of panels on all of them because the prototype has an even number on all the pieces that I can find photos of. And that causes the rivet detail on the microengineering girder components to work out correctly. And then here I just knocked a bunch of T-pins into this MDF. That's the reason I was using MDF as a surface here, so I could pin it so I could force the curve. That very slight curve. It's easy to get it to curve some, but that hammer's a bit overkill. I couldn't find my trim hammer.
I was just going to say, you're using a sledgehammer.
Yeah. To barely tap
T-pins.
a T-pin. I found my trim hammer now, but at the time I was impatient and I just grabbed that little 4-pound sledge and knocked T-pins in with it. But I needed it to hold this slight bend, so that holds it down flat, puts that perfect fixture. Then I use this aluminum tape. I'll explain why in just a second. And I cut these pieces that are like 4 inches long, and cut a bunch of these pieces. And I'm taping the top of it. So now I've got it facing up. The track will go on top of that flat surface. The tiles will go directly on top of that. Well, basically directly on top of that, but you'll see that in a few weeks or a few months when we get to that. But then I tape the top of this. And then the biggest reason is so then once I flip it over, I can fill the slight bit of gap with epoxy. So, and I didn't want that epoxy to run out or run through. One, because I need it to stay in the gap to help give some strength. And second, so it doesn't glue it to my work surface. And then one of the tricks to using this aluminum tape is to kind of rub it or burnish it, actually, I would say is the proper terminology, is to burnish it down. So here I'm using I think I was using like a ruler. I think I went to using that MDF block, but you want to burnish it down. If you burnish it down real good, it's very thin. I mean, it's probably a 64th thick. It's very thin material, so it won't upset my tie.
The glue that's on it is thicker than the aluminum.
What's that?
The glue that's on it is thicker than the aluminum.
Yes. Oh, it's spectacularly thin, and especially if you burnish it and don't get anything. So it's not going to upset my tie installation at all, which I'm going to use transfer tape and epoxy on the ties as well. So I don't think I'll have any problem with that, but I just burnish it down to get it nice and smooth. And this stuff's pretty tough too. I mean, by itself, you can rip it like aluminum foil, but when it's actually adhered to that material, and since all the gaps are closed up, basically, it was already really quite strong just by cutting the top and the side and then burnishing this down so it gets a good, nice contact. And, and it like all tapes are basically pressure adhered tape. So I just run them across and then run an X-Acto at a slight angle to cut that tape back. So it's just on the top. I didn't want anything to mess with how the girders adhere to the sides of it. I thought about wrapping it over, but it would have helped a little bit with the glue process. But I didn't want to get into the way. I didn't want anything to give me a problem with getting the girders to stick. And I already need to rough it up, kind of rough up the side of this aluminum to get the epoxy to to bind the girders to it anyway. So, but it already, when I picked it up out of here, it was already really quite strong. So I'm just making sure that everything after I cut it, all the sides are all burnished down real well. And then that tape should stay there for a long time without any problems. So it already holds its shape basically after that. So then I do the finagling that I do in this room with an 8-foot stick to spin it around, get it upside down. And tape is an adhesive. It's nothing magical about it. It's an adhesive on paper or plastic or aluminum. In this case, it needs a little time to set up as well to make sure it adheres and to make sure that my solvents will not mess with that. So after I get this pinned down, just to hold its shape, I give it a little time before I do the epoxy work. And I should have found that trim hammer because that really does look goofy using a sledgehammer to put in T-pins. But I kept it in the video because I thought it was funny especially after watching it. So here I come back and file everything. I want it to be, quite smooth, especially so I don't nick my fingers while I'm putting glue in. And I've got it clamped just in the center and on each side just to make sure that it stays true and flat. But sanded it and cleaned it all up. And then the glue. Now the glue's a little bit of a trick. So here I'm going to glue it down, and then I'm going to put these little thin bits of tape. I think they're 1/2 inch wide by however wide the tape is. I think it's 2 inches. So it's a little 1/2 inch wide strip that after I put the epoxy in the gap, I put these little 1/2 inch pieces over top of it. That way, when you're looking up from underneath, of course, I'll paint all of that black later. But once it's all painted black, that little bit of aluminum tape will smooth out. There won't be an obvious gash there. That also makes sure that the epoxy stays nice and true. And I love those big, I got these big 2-foot rubber bands that I wrap up that tape with, because that aluminum tape, if it doesn't work, like you can't just throw it around like you do paper tape or masking tape or something. It gets kind of dinged up and banged up pretty bad. And if you want to use it for anything cosmetic, you want it to stay pretty nice and neat and not get nicked, because it gets little creases and stuff in it. So here, 5-minute epoxy. But I needed to fill that gap. So I got to do a couple things to this epoxy. So it's regular 5-minute epoxy. And then I'm mixing a little bit of xylene in it. Xylene is a solvent that's especially useful in epoxies. And I think I found this from some guys who epoxy boats. But xylene is an epoxy specific for epoxy thinning solvent. And you could use it for a few other things too, but it's fairly caustic, so you want to be careful with it. But just a few drops of xylene goes a long way. And then I've got some aluminum powder. And I actually have a bottle of aluminum powder, but this is what I kept from when I cut these gaps. I didn't even see the reason to go buy the little or to go find the little bottle of aluminum fillings or whatever.
You probably would have been like me. You wouldn't have been able to find it when you want it.
That's what I figured too. And then it made a big pile of this stuff. And the xylene dilutes the epoxy, because epoxy, of course, is thick and doesn't want to flow anywhere. And unless you're filling a water basin with it, then it'll go through any pinhole you leave. But it doesn't want to flow down into that gap very well. So the xylene works like a thinner. Obviously, it makes it quite thin, but it also reduces surface tension. It works as a surfactant to the epoxy as well. So it will drop right down into that gap, which is going right down in on top of the aluminum tape that's on the other side. So after I get it to fill that gap, and make sure it stays kind of smooth, then I start working this tape over top of it, this little 1/2 inch piece. And because there's some aluminum fiber, filling in there, some aluminum powder, I kind of rub and burnish the aluminum tape down as well, so it's a nice smooth surface. I think when it's all painted black and the girders are on the side, and this aluminum channel is about a 1/2 inch tall, and the girders are about 1 1/8 inches. Plus, we have the X bracing that's over top of it as well. So once it's all painted black, all of these little gashes that are cut and the tape, all that should just disappear, I think. But I did want it to be smooth. I didn't want anything that would catch your eye, or if it did happen to show. So I got the epoxy, and you can see a little bit there of that. The epoxy doesn't really set on the surface much at all. It drops right down into that gap and fills that gap in. So much so that on the piece that's complete that I've got here, you can't see through even the sides where I didn't cover it in, where you could look up through at an angle or something, or peel the tape back, and it basically filled it in. So that's where I got to with this episode. That's where I'll show you that was complete. That shows and I've got the complete module. Actually, I have some pictures that I could show you. I've got it hung in place temporarily. I have, and just to show you what to remind you of what we're building. We're emulating this bridge in the relatively modern era, or 1986. Or there's the original picture of it. It's a substantial structure. The prototype would be about 7.5 feet long. I had to do a little bit of compression. Mine is about 6'2". And here's that piece. Here's that piece in place, not permanently. I'm still working on the top level, and there will be a module under it. But you get an idea of how high it is in the air. It's at like 84 inches off the floor. And as you first walk in, it's here. There'll be 5 towers under it every 8 foot 8 inches. And then here you can see the slight curve. And while it's a slight curve, it's only a 22 foot radius. So it's a very slight curve. It's only offset by about 1.5 inches, 2 inches, 3 inches, something like that, offset in the center of the bridge from straight through. But that curve is just, to me, it's really elegant because the prototype is curved. As you can see, the prototype has that very slight curve end to end, and I've basically emulated that.
Let's get it clear. A bridge of this type with the plate girder does not actually curve.
Absolutely right.
It's straight sections that are put in at angles, and the
That's
track
right.
on top curves.
Absolutely. Yes, the bridges are. Yeah, that's the point of the cuts and the bend. The bridge is curved track on top of a angled, connected angled bridge. Okay, so yeah, Robert said about the metal filings. Why to use those in the glue? Part of it is that it's an aggregate in the epoxy, so you can make epoxy significantly stronger by adding an aggregate. So I've built some structures. I've got some structures here that are built with a superstructure underneath, and then they're skinned or clad in some kind of construction. And I use wood flour, so spectacularly fine sawdust, basically mixed with epoxy, and it's a lot stronger than epoxy on its own. And you can make fillets at the joint of the wall with that. So the aluminum powder, just as an aggregate, gives a lot more strength to the epoxy, and it also helps the epoxy bond to the aluminum structure because you have like chemistry in it. So. And I tested it in a couple different ways, and that seemed to be.
As I said to Robert, I wasn't going to ask that question.
Oh, okay. And then I put aluminum tape over top of it too, mostly just so it's a smooth surface.
Right. So
But
it doesn't flow through.
on the top of it, it didn't flow through
Yeah.
because it would have, especially with xylene in it.
It'll
Xylene
stop at the
makes
tape.
it really, really thin. If you've ever put MEK in contact cement, that's what I do for head and track. It takes contact cement that's really thick, like honey, and turns it into something that flows as easy as water with a few drops. The same
So
thing's true of xylene, but it has a little bit different flow properties than contact cement.
Robert says, and then did I see correctly that you put aluminum tape over the epoxy before it's set?
Yes, I want the epoxy to also bond that aluminum tape as well. I want, the entire thing is sandwiched with aluminum tape. Mostly that's
Okay.
cosmetic, but I let the epoxy set up a little bit. I gave it maybe 10 minutes, and it's 5-minute epoxy. The xylene slows it down a little bit, But it was still probably a little soft at that point. But that let the tape get a bond.
Right. CV Rail says like baking powder in CA. The baking powder in CA, it actually weakens the CA, but it makes a better gap filler if you
And it
use the baking
activates it,
soda.
makes it work
Yep.
real fast too.
Yep. Yep.
But adding aggregate works like adding aggregate in concrete. So Portland cement, the basic component of concrete, is not necessarily that strong. It's the combination of the aggregate that makes it really quite strong. I mean, it's a combination of all the chemistry, but the aggregates improve the bond of epoxy considerably. So, and yes, Robert, it's slightly over engineered. That's my tendency. If you guys have any more questions for me, we'll get back to them in a second too. But let's see Ralph's bridge. This thing's spectacular, by
Okay.
the way.
Before we do that, I have to put out the disclaimer. This is a Hunter Line bridge, and at the time I didn't have the funds, and I found this bridge on eBay. Pardon me, Evil Bay.
Yeah,
Uh, I was told it had everything, and with all the parts that you get, it's very, very hard to itemize everything when you get it. It was an open package, so when I got it, it didn't have the instructions in it, and there was a whole package of scale 14-inch by 14-inch lumber missing, and they were 2 feet long. So I had to do with what I had, not knowing this stuff was missing. And then in putting the bridge together, if I was going to do it again, instead of doing the top and bottom, I would do the sides first. So roll the tape.
well, that's interesting. Well, I don't think I've seen any problem with that for how much of the video we're showcasing tonight.
Well,
So
and the thing is, I had only the plan. They give you a plan drawing, and I think I showed it in the video.
yeah,
That's the
playing
only thing
through
I
it looks
had to
quite
go
nice.
by. It's the only
But it's
thing I
like an
had to go by.
exploded view.
Some of them,
Yeah,
yes. And you'll have to excuse me if I have to wipe my nose. I'm suffering from allergies today this week.
I
So
always do anymore. All right, roll that beautiful bead footage. He says. All right.
so I started out with the plan and everything underneath a piece of glass. That's what it looks like when it's done. I did Andy's trick with the setting up the that those are the beams that go underneath your ties. So I'm that's the it's there's actually 4 beams there. I put the ties on a piece of tape and just put some glue down. I'm using Canopy Glue. It likes to stiffen up in the nozzle of the bottle. So every once in a while, you'll see me either pick at it with a plastic toothpick or whatever. But so I'm using right over the plan, put the ties down, um, and now I'm doing what they call the bottom cord. It's actually 4 pieces put together, and they're spaced by a 30-second piece of wood, 32nd inch piece of wood that they use for spacers. So when these 4 go together, there's a gap between them. In real life, that's the way they are. It would be like a washer between them. Um, so now I'm doing it again on top of the plan. That's where the spacers are going to go. There's the spacers going on. So I cut them from a long strip of wood. And again, when it came to that, a lot of this, half the spacers were missing. So I had to make some of my own. I just happened to have a piece of lumber that was the same thickness. It wasn't the same width, but the same thickness was good enough. That's all I needed. What happened? Oh, okay. Start again. The stuck piece of glue. Eventually, what I ended up doing is put a blob of glue on the table, on the glass, and with my toothpick applying it where I needed it. because I was struggling so much with the bottle. But there's 4 pieces that have to be made like this. 2 for the bottom and 2 shorter ones for the top. So I use the turn it over on its side and use the glass, because the glass is nice and flat, to get it lined up properly, and then roll it back over, put some more spacers. I like using Canopy Glue for this kind of thing because it gives me a long enough working time. It's a PVA style of glue, like carpenter's glue, but it's not as strong. It stays pliable for a long time. Once the bridge was done, there's no seeing that there's any pliableness in it, but it goes together nicely. And I do that with all wood kits. So one more piece to go on. Now, what I ended up doing, I lined these spacers up with that. You see the double line on the plan. That's where a threaded rod is going to go through. In real life, it's a threaded rod. So on the end of it, it has you put nut bolt washer details. So once this is all together, then I have to drill a hole right through and put the wire in. And the wire is included in the kit, which is great. So they go across the top and bottom. They also go from top down to the bottom. You can see the dark lines right on the edge of the picture. That's what it looks like when it's done. So now I'm doing, I think it's the bottom cord. No, it's the top cord. It has the cross members in it. And this was kind of fun to get these things to fit in, because you can play all you want and try and get the cut right, and when you go and put it in place, it's either too long or too short. And you go, what the hell did I just do? You know, they give you just enough to make mistakes, and then once you get used to it, it goes in pretty quick. See, I have the drop of glue on the wax paper, or yeah, it's a piece of wax paper I've got it on, so it doesn't stick to the glass. I'm right down on the plan. The piece of glass that I used is 1/4 inch glass, and if you're not careful and looking directly down over it, like I mean right over it, there's a little bit of it's just not going to look right to you. It's not going to line up. But this is the first bridge of this type that I built. If I build another one, and that may happen, I know where to go with it, where to start, where to finish. So I put a dab of glue on either end of it, and I put a dab of glue where they cross. So on this, the bottom one, the cross members are one on top of the other. When I go to do the top member, because it's visible, you actually have to cut, what do you call it, a dado or a rabbit? You cut a notch where they cross in both of them, so that they mesh together as one, the same height, same dimension.
like a half lap kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. And in gluing the bottom like this with these cross members, I ended up, because I was pushing so hard to get the glue into place, I ended up cracking one of them right where it joins or crosses the other one. That's the one I broke.
Well, most of the pieces are somewhat fragile, which is amazing. Like the microengineering towers that I'm building, they're really fragile and flexible until you get 3 or 4 pieces put together, and then they start
Exactly.
getting really strong.
Exactly. I can remember, and this was a long time ago, but I can remember at school, uh, building. We were given a task of building a bridge using spaghetti, and you wouldn't think that you'd be able to build a bridge with spaghetti. And you're talking about fragile. Spaghetti's fragile. But once
Yeah.
it's all together and glued in place, you'd be amazed. We ended up putting 35 pounds on the bridge. It was a foot and a half long. 35 pounds before it broke.
Wow.
And this
This
was
is
not grade school either. This was in architectural school. But it's coming in handy.
Now this is where I stopped it for this episode. Is right after you
That's
get this complete.
that's fine. But again, I was going. There's the bottom one. I
Yeah.
was going strictly by the plan because I didn't have the documentation on the step by step, which was missing from the package. So I
Do
since
they provide step by step, but you just
they
had the exploded
they
view?
they do. They do. I contacted Rick Hunter of Hunterline, and I said to him I need to buy the extra wood that was missing, and I told him what I was doing and so on, and I was honest with him. I told him I got it on eBay. Um, can I buy the wood from you? And he said absolutely. And he said from what I'm getting from your email, you didn't have the instructions either. And you got that right. I went by the plan. So he sent me the instructions, and they're color photographs, and everything's explained on what to do, how to do, when to do. So even though the bridge looks um, complicated, it goes together easily, and it works out well. So that's what I'm working on, and I have behind me here. You see this bridge here. Well, this bridge goes into an aluminum channel like Andy's working on, uh, for 8 feet. And at the end of the 8 feet is where that Howe Truss is going to go. Everything else is plate girder up to that point. So I'll try and get some photographs of where it's going to go, and I have to build the abutments for it, um, the stone wall to hold it up, um, and we'll save that for another show. So, are there any questions out there?
Um, not seen any yet. If you guys have any questions or uh, post them, or if you think of questions after, I'll check the comments before our next show in a couple weeks. Um, if you want to, if you provide a comment to this YouTube video, we'll go check those and try to address any questions next week or in a couple weeks. Um, Ralph's abutments, I'm really looking forward to seeing him build those as well. I haven't decided if I'm
It's
doing
going to
my
be the
abutment.
stone.
Yeah, stone. Mine are cast concrete, and I've already got them partially made, so I'm not sure if I'll do those right away the next episode or if I'll move on because the abutments for mine are pretty critical to the core structure because the actual the aluminum piece locks into the abutments, so the abutments are pretty important structurally. Whereas most of the time you build a bridge, build it by itself as a thing, and then go build abutments and set it on top like they're separate pieces. In this case, my bridge and abutments, kind of make up a single superstructure. They work hand in hand.
Right.
But
See,
yeah, Robert, you should build it.
John Knopfel was asking if I'm feeling okay. I'm feeling rotten. I'm suffering from allergies, back pain, and every time I sneeze with these allergies, it puts my back into spasm. So you're lucky it didn't happen while we're here. Everything just freezes up on me.
Sure sign
Anyway,
that we're all getting older when a sneeze is a risk. I know it, though. I know it all too well. That's part of the reason we're delayed by a couple weeks. We were basically everybody I know around here was sick. My wife's still sick. So I guess it's time of the year or something. I don't know, but I'm not used to getting sick like that. But Ed Roberts picking on me a little bit. But in my defense, this is scratch built, completely. And after Googling and looking around for several years, I've not seen anybody that can answer every challenge I have. So it took some experimentation, some testing, a lot of thought. Hence the reason we had the first show of this series with you, Robert, and Ralph, so we could kind of hammer out and talk about the 78 conversations we had had about this thing previously. So, and even
and
since I started
78
on it,
different solutions.
yeah, I have to figure it out. I don't, it's a unique thing. Each of our layouts, are unique. I mean, none of it's, nothing new under the sun per se, but how we put all these things together makes everybody's model railroad a very unique artistic creation. And what I'm doing with mine does have some unique challenges.
Yeah. It doesn't matter which bridge you're looking at. I have a bridge along that crosses our major highway, and it's an open steel trestle, or whatever you want to call it. I don't. It's not a trestle. It's truss. Um, and one side of it, on as you drive under it, what the left side is square. The right side has the slope on it, and it goes across the highway on an angle.
Oh yeah, it's
As
skewed or whatever.
Yeah, and as you go under it and look back, the opposite is you have a straight at this side and a curved at the other side. So that, I guess, that allows for the way the bridge hits the abutment. I don't know.
The first
I
bridge
would
I
I
built is everything is skewed. The towers are skewed, the river crossing under skewed, the abutments were skewed on the prototype, and it's the first bridge and the first serious structure I had built in 20 years. As I come back to the hobby, I built that bridge first, and
Is that the
everything
one?
is skewed.
Is that the one you curved?
Yeah, it's the one that is, and it's like it's 5 segments. It's the approaches
You
are
like curved
deck
bridges.
girders, and the 3 pieces in the middle are through plate bridges. No,
Yeah.
they're deck plates, the 2 approaches, and then there's 3 through plates, and it's like a 12 or 14 foot radius. Everything's skewed on it, but it has an easement as it starts. So it starts basically straight and immediately is into an easement. So I just figured it out mathematically. I even figured that easement out mathematically, where I normally use a bit stick method to get easements. I figured it out mathematically and then printed it all out and then laid transparency paper over it or wax paper like you were just doing with your construction, and then built the thing right over top of or laid it out and cut the pieces to size, forgetting about the math. I don't care what size the pieces are exactly. I just built it real world right over top of the plans.
You'll probably see it backwards, but it's Canopy Glue. It's called Formula 560. Robert, you were asking what kind of glue? Is it like wood glue? Yes, it is, but it stays pliable.
It's flexible.
Excuse me. Yeah.
It's also completely transparent. So, I mean, it's reason they call it canopy glue is the RC guys use it to install canopies. But anytime I put windows in a structure, I for sure use that. But the fact that it stays flexible makes it really useful. It's not as strong as, say wood glue or something, but you don't need that much strength.
You don't. You don't need that much strength.
No, it's
Another
real nice to
another
work with.
glue that I use is Weld Bond, which basically is the same thing. It goes clear after you when it dries. But
That's probably the strongest wood glue I've worked with is Weld Bond. I like the Gorilla brand wood glue because it sets up so quickly. I mean, it sets up in 7 or 8 minutes. You can clamp something, a rubber band structure together, give it 15 or 20 minutes, and then you can take the rubber bands off and work with it. Whereas Weld Bond takes a little longer, but it is extremely strong.
Yeah.
Well, all right, gentlemen. If you guys have any questions, drop them in the comments, or we'll be back in a couple weeks, back on schedule again. God willing, and the creek don't rise, as they say. So, or as they say around here. So we'll see you guys in a couple weeks. We'll see where Ralph went from where we stopped with his, and we'll move on with my bridge project as well. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you guys again in a couple weeks.